gunshot cracked through the frozen air before Elena Voss even saw where it came from. She dropped to her knees behind a fallen log, heart slamming against her ribs, snow soaking through her jeans. Somewhere close, a small creature was screaming in pain, a high, thin sound that did not belong to any animal she had ever heard. She pushed forward without thinking. Branches tore at her sleeves. The screaming grew louder, then broke into a whimper, then silence. Elena's boots sank into the snow as she rounded a thicket of frozen brambles and found the source. A wolf cub, no bigger than a house cat, was caught in a steel snare, one back leg twisted at a terrible angle. Its fur was silver gray, matted with blood, and its dark eyes locked onto hers with something that looked almost like a plea. Elena had spent 4 years volunteering at the wildlife clinic outside Black Pine Forest. She had pulled foxes from ditches and owls from barbed wire. She knew the rules. Do not approach a wounded wild animal alone. Call for backup. Wait. But the cub's eyes held hers, and there was no time to wait. She stripped off her jacket and wrapped it around her hands before reaching for the snare's wire. The cub snapped weakly at her fingers, more out of fear than fury, and she spoke to it in a low, steady voice, the same voice she used on frightened dogs at the clinic. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise. Just hold still." Her fingers worked the wire loose, the metal biting into her palms even through the jacket. The cub whimpered again, and then, with a final twist, the snare fell open, and the small leg came free. Elena scooped the cub against her chest, feeling its rapid heartbeat through her sweater. It was warmer than she expected, almost feverish, and it trembled violently. That was when she heard the voices. 2 men were moving through the trees behind her, flashlights slicing through the dark. Their words carried on the wind, low and urgent. "The trap's tripped, something's in it. Get over there before it chews its leg off and runs." Elena's blood turned cold. These were not forest rangers. Rangers did not set illegal snares deep in a protected woodland at night. She pressed herself against the trunk of a wide pine, holding the cub tightly against her chest, willing it to stay silent. The cub, as if understanding, buried its face into her collarbone and went still. The flashlight swept closer. She could hear boots crunching through frost-covered leaves, could hear one man muttering about the cold, about how much they were being paid for this job, about how the client wanted the pup alive and unharmed. Elena's mind raced. A paid job. Someone had sent these men here on purpose, to capture this specific animal. That was not poaching for sport. That was something else entirely, something deliberate. The beam of a flashlight passed within a foot of her shoulder. She held her breath until her lungs burned. "Snare's empty," one voice said. "Closer now. Something got it loose." "That's not possible. Nobody's out here." "Well, somebody was. Look, the wire's been cut clean." Elena's stomach dropped. She had left evidence. If they found her footprints in the snow, they would follow the trail straight to her. She began backing away slowly, one careful step at a time. The cub pressed silent against her chest. Her boot caught on a hidden root, and she stumbled, catching herself against a tree trunk with a soft thud. The flashlight swung toward the sound. "Over there!" Elena did not wait to see how close they were. She turned and ran, her boots pounding through the snow, ducking low branches, praying the darkness would swallow her before the light did. Behind her, the men shouted to each other, spreading out, their voices growing fainter as she pushed deeper into a part of the forest she barely recognized, running on instinct alone. Her cabin sat nearly 2 miles from where she had entered the woods that evening, tucked along a quiet dirt road at the edge of Black Pine, far from her usual walking trail. She had wandered further than planned tonight, chasing the strange howling sound that had first pulled her off her path. Now that decision might cost her everything. She ran until her lungs screamed and her legs shook, until the shouting behind her faded into the hush of the forest, and there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic little heartbeat against her chest. When she finally saw the warm yellow glow of her cabin window through the trees, relief nearly buckled her knees. She burst through the door, slammed it shut, and threw the bolt with shaking hands. Only then did she allow herself to look down at the small creature in her arms. The cub looked back at her, exhausted. Its injured leg held awkwardly against its body, its silver fur dark with melted snow and blood. Up close, in the light of her cabin, she noticed something strange. Its eyes were not the flat amber of a normal wolf. They were a deep, startling gray, almost human in their depth and awareness. Elena told herself it was exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. Wild animals did not have expressions like grief or gratitude. And yet, as she laid the cub gently on a folded blanket near the fireplace and began cleaning its wound with trembling hands, she could have sworn the little creature was watching her the way a person would, weighing her, deciding whether to trust her. "You're safe now," she whispered, more to comfort herself than the animal. "Whatever those men wanted with you, they're not getting it." The cub's tail gave the faintest thump against the blanket, and despite everything, despite her racing heart and her shaking hands, Elena felt the corner of her mouth lift into an exhausted smile. She worked through the next hour with practiced hands, splinting the injured leg with a rolled bandage and a strip of wood from her kindling basket, cleaning the shallow cuts left by the snare's teeth. The cub whimpered only twice, otherwise enduring her care with a stillness that seemed almost too calm for a wild animal in pain. When she finally sat back, wiping sweat from her brow despite the winter chill, she studied the little wolf properly for the first time. It was young, perhaps only a few months old, but something about its bone structure seemed off. Its paws were slightly too large for its body, its skull shaped in a way that reminded her, absurdly, of a human infant's proportions, rather than a true wolf pup's. She shook the thought away. Exhaustion and fear were making her imagine things. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and Elena's mind returned to the men in the woods. Someone had hired them to capture this cub specifically, alive and unharmed. That meant this small creature was valuable to someone, valuable enough to justify illegal traps in a protected forest, valuable enough for men to brave a snowstorm at night. She glanced toward her phone on the counter, debating whether to call the local ranger station or the police. But what would she say? That she had freed an animal from an illegal trap and then run from armed men in the woods? They would ask questions she did not have safe answers to. And worse, if word got out that she had the cub, whoever had hired those hunters might come looking for it here. The safest thing, she decided, was to keep quiet until morning, treat the cub's wounds, and figure out her next move in daylight, when her mind was not clouded by fear and cold. She banked the fire and dragged a spare mattress from the closet to the living room floor, unwilling to leave the cub alone, even for the length of a hallway. As she lay down, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, she watched the small silver shape rise and fall with steady breathing beside the fireplace. "Tomorrow," she murmured into the dark, "we'll figure out where you belong." She did not know, as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, that far to the north, in a place hidden from every map, a powerful man had just woken from a deep and terrible unrest, sensing, in some way he could not explain, that a piece of his own blood was in danger. Elena woke twice in the night, startled by imagined sounds outside her window, each time finding the cub exactly where she had left it, curled tight and trembling slightly in its sleep, as though caught in a nightmare it could not escape. By the third time she woke, gray light was beginning to creep through the curtains, and the cub's dark gray eyes were already open, watching her with an intensity that made the hair on her arms rise. "Good morning to you too," she said softly, sitting up and rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The cub let out a small sound, not quite a whimper and not quite a word, and Elena felt, for the first time since she had pulled it from the snare, a genuine chill crawl down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about this animal was not right. Or rather, she thought, staring into those unnervingly aware eyes, something about it was not entirely an animal at all. She pushed the thought away, as impossible, and focused instead on the practical matters of the morning, changing the bandage, warming a small bowl of broth, checking the cabin's locks, twice, before allowing herself to relax even slightly. Outside, the forest lay silent under a fresh blanket of snow, footprints from the night before already smoothed over by the wind. But Elena knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that the danger had not passed. The men who lost their prize last night would not simply give up, and whoever they worked for would want to know exactly where their missing prize had gone. She had no way of knowing that her small act of mercy in the snow had already set something enormous into motion, something that stretched far beyond the borders of Black Pine Forest, into a world of ancient bloodlines, broken alliances, and a king whose fury, once ignited, would not be easily calmed. For now, all Elena knew was that a small, wounded creature had looked into her eyes and trusted her, and she was not about to let it down. Morning brought no peace. By the time the sun had fully risen over Black Pine, 2 black trucks were parked at the edge of the main forest trail, close enough to Elena's road that she could hear their engines idling from her kitchen window. She stood frozen at the sink, dish towel forgotten in her hands, watching through the curtain as 2 men stepped out of the trucks. She recognized their jackets, thick canvas hunting coats, the same ones she had glimpsed briefly in the flashlight beams the night before. The cub, resting on a folded towel near the fireplace, lifted its head sharply, ears pinned back, a low sound rumbling in its small chest that was nowhere near a whimper. It was almost a growl, low and controlled, far too deliberate for an injured pup barely a few months old. "Stay quiet," Elena whispered, more to herself than the animal, as she watched the 2 men walk slowly along the tree line, scanning the ground. One of them crouched near the edge of her property, examining something in the snow. Her stomach dropped. Footprints. Her footprints, leading from the woods straight to her door, only partially disguised by the fresh snowfall overnight. She backed away from the window, scooped the cub gently into her arms, and carried it into the small bedroom at the rear of the cabin, tucking it beneath a pile of blankets in the closet. It resisted at first, squirming against her hold, but quieted the moment she pressed a steadying hand against its side. "Please," she murmured, "just a few minutes. I need you to be silent." A heavy knock rattled her front door. Elena smoothed her hair, steadied her breathing, and forced her face into something resembling calm, before opening the door just wide enough to look out. The man standing on her porch was broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and eyes the color of wet slate. His companion stood a few steps behind, scanning the tree line with the restless energy of someone used to being obeyed quickly. "Morning, ma'am," the first man said, his voice pleasant, in a way that did not match the coldness in his eyes. "Sorry to bother you this early. We're tracking a wounded animal that escaped one of our traps last night. Wondered if you'd seen anything unusual around your property." "An animal," Elena repeated carefully. "What kind?" "Wolf pup," the man said, watching her face closely. "Silver coat. Might look sickly. Might be limping. Dangerous little thing if it panics. We'd hate for it to hurt someone before we can bring it in safely." The lie sat poorly on his tongue, and Elena, who had spent years reading the subtle tells of frightened and defensive animals at the clinic, recognized the same tells now in a human face. He was lying about the danger. He was not worried about her safety. He was worried about losing something valuable. "I haven't seen anything," she said, keeping her voice steady. "It's been quiet out here all morning." The man's eyes flicked past her shoulder, into the dim interior of the cabin, lingering for half a second too long on the folded blanket by the fireplace, the one still faintly stained with the cub's blood from the night before. Elena's pulse spiked, but she kept her expression carefully blank. "Mind if we take a quick look around your property? Won't take but a minute." "Actually, I do mind," Elena said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "It's early, I haven't had my coffee, and I have somewhere to be this morning. If I see anything, I'll be sure to call it in." The man's smile did not reach his eyes, but he nodded slowly, stepping back from the door. "Of course. Sorry to trouble you. Here." He pressed a small card into her hand, a phone number scrawled beneath a name that meant nothing to her. "If you see the pup, call this number right away. Don't try to handle it yourself. It's more dangerous than it looks." Elena watched them walk back toward their trucks, forcing herself to close the door slowly, calmly, rather than slamming it the way every instinct screamed at her to do. Only once the engines rumbled to life and the trucks pulled away down the snowy road did she allow her knees to buckle, sliding down against the door, until she sat on the cold floor, breathing hard. The cub emerged from the bedroom a moment later, dragging its splinted legs slightly, and pressed its small body against her side, as though offering comfort in return for the silence she had kept. "They know," Elena whispered, running a shaking hand over the cub's fur. "They know you're here somewhere. We're not safe yet." She spent the rest of the morning pacing between the windows, watching the tree line for any sign of returning trucks, her mind spinning through possibilities. She could call the police and explain everything, though she doubted they would believe a story about hired hunters chasing an unusually intelligent wolf pup through a protected forest. She could try to drive the cub to a proper wildlife sanctuary hours away, though the roads out of Black Pine were narrow and easily watched. Or she could wait, hidden, until the cub healed enough to be released safely back into deeper wilderness, far from wherever these men were watching. None of the options felt safe, All of them felt like gambling with a life that had already trusted her once. By late afternoon, exhaustion and stress had worn Elena down enough that she allowed herself to sit on the living room floor beside the cub, simply watching it rest in a patch of weak winter sunlight through the window. Its breathing had steadied since the morning, its color looking marginally better despite the ordeal. "What are you?" she asked quietly, studying the strange depth in its gray eyes. "What could possibly be worth all this?" As if in answer, the cub's body gave a sudden violent shudder, its limbs twitching, its small frame arching in what looked like pain. Elena scrambled forward in alarm, reaching for it, fearing some delayed injury or infection setting in. But what happened next stole the breath from her lungs entirely. The cub's silver fur seemed to ripple like water under moonlight, its small frame stretching, bones shifting with soft, sickening cracks that should have caused unbearable pain but drew only a low groan instead of a scream. Elena scrambled backward, pressing herself against the couch, watching in stunned horror and disbelief as the wolf pup's shape twisted, lengthened, and reformed. Within the span of perhaps 30 seconds, the silver-furred cub was gone, and in its place lay a small boy, no older than 7 or 8, curled on her living room floor, his dark hair damp with sweat, one leg wrapped in the same bandage she had applied hours earlier, his gray eyes now set into an entirely human face, staring up at her, with the same unmistakable awareness she had noticed the night before. "You saved me," the boy said, his voice small and hoarse, but perfectly clear. "You're not scared. Why aren't you scared?" Elena opened her mouth, but no words came out. Every rational explanation her mind reached for collapsed instantly, beneath the impossible truth lying on her living room floor. She was not simply harboring an injured wild animal. She had, without any understanding of what she was doing, pulled a child from a hunter's trap, a child who was somehow also a wolf, a child that powerful, dangerous men were willing to hunt through a protected forest to capture. Whatever world this small boy belonged to, Elena understood, in that frozen, breathless moment, she had just stepped directly into its center, and there would be no simple way back out. Elena's first instinct was to back further away, but something in the boy's face, a raw exhaustion mixed with quiet hope, kept her rooted in place. She forced her breathing to slow, forced her mind to accept, at least for the moment, that logic and impossibility could exist in the same room together. "What's your name?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Milo," the boy said, pulling the blanket tighter around his small shoulders. "My father is going to be so angry. Not at you. At them. At whoever sent those men." "Your father," Elena repeated slowly. "Who is your father, Milo?" The boy hesitated, glancing toward the window as though the answer itself might summon danger straight to her door. "He's the leader of our pack. Everyone calls him the Alpha King. He rules all of Blackpine, and the lands past it too. If he knew someone tried to hurt me, he wouldn't just be angry. He'd tear the whole forest apart looking for them." Elena sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, processing words that sounded like they belonged in a children's story rather than her quiet, ordinary life. "You're saying wolves, real wolves, have a kingdom, a ruler." Milo nodded, wincing slightly as he shifted his splinted leg. "We're not like regular wolves. We can look like this." He gestured at his human shape. "Or like that." He nodded toward the blanket where he had lain as a cub only minutes before. "My father says our family has led the pack for hundreds of years, but somebody wanted to hurt me, and I don't know why." "The men who set that trap," Elena said slowly, piecing it together. "They weren't hunting an ordinary wolf. They knew exactly what they were looking for." "They work for someone," Milo said, his young voice suddenly heavy with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. "Someone who wants to hurt my father through me. There's another pack, to the east, led by a man named Victor Kane. He's wanted to take my father's throne for a long time. If something happened to me, it would break my father's spirit. That's what Victor wants." Elena's mind reeled at the political weight behind a child's simple explanation, at the idea that an 8-year-old boy could speak so plainly about assassination plots and stolen thrones. And yet, looking at the quiet certainty in Milo's gray eyes, she believed every word. "We need to get you home," she said, standing and moving toward the window, scanning the tree line out of habit now rather than surprise. "Your father must be searching for you." "He is," Milo said quietly. "I can feel it. It's hard to explain, But when he's close, when he's searching hard, I feel a pull, like a string tied around my chest. It's been pulling all day. As if summoned by the boy's words, a low, distant howl rolled across the forest outside, mournful and enormous, the kind of sound that seemed to shake the very air. Elena's skin prickled. It was unlike any wolf call she had ever heard on her nature walks. Deeper, more resonant, carrying something that felt disturbingly close to grief and fury combined. "That's not him," Milo said quickly, before she could ask. "That's one of his search parties. They're looking in the wrong part of the forest. We're too far from the packlands for them to find me easily. Then how do we get you back safely, without running into those hunters again?" Milo considered this with the same seriousness Elena imagined a king's advisor might use, his small brow furrowed in thought. "There's someone my father trusts more than anyone. His second, a man named Aiden. If we could get a message to him, he'd come. But he'd need proof that I'm really here, and that it's really safe." Elena glanced at the small boy's leg, still wrapped in her makeshift bandage, and made a decision that surprised even herself with how quickly it formed. "Then we'll find a way to reach him. But quietly. Those men in the trucks are still out there, and I don't know how far their search extends." Night fell early over Black Pine, the winter sun sinking behind the tree line well before 5 in the evening, plunging the forest into a deep, watchful darkness. Elena kept every light in the cabin dimmed, curtains drawn tight, while Milo rested on the couch, drifting in and out of an uneasy sleep, his small human hand occasionally twitching, as though caught in dreams of running on 4 legs through familiar woods. Around 9 that evening, a soft, deliberate knock echoed against her front door. 3 slow taps followed by a pause, then 2 quick ones. Nothing like the aggressive pounding of the hunters that morning. Elena's pulse spiked as she moved cautiously toward the door, glancing back at Milo, who had bolted upright on the couch, eyes wide and alert. "That's him," Milo whispered urgently. "That's Aiden's knock. He always does it that way, so Father's guards know it's safe to open up." Elena hesitated, hand hovering over the deadbolt. "How can you be sure? What if it's a trick?" Milo shook his head firmly. "Nobody outside the pack knows that signal. Not even Victor's people. Please, Elena, open the door." She unlocked the bolt slowly, opening the door only a crack at first, her body angled to shield most of the entrance. Standing on her porch, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, breaking through scattered clouds, was a tall man with sharp features, dark hair damp from what looked like a long trek through snow, and eyes so pale gray they seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. A thin line of dried blood traced along his jaw, evidence of some recent struggle. "You're harboring the young prince," the man said, his voice low and controlled, though tension radiated from every line of his body. "I mean you no harm. My name is Aiden. I serve his father. Please, may I see him?" Before Elena could answer, Milo's voice rang out from behind her, relief flooding every word. "Aiden, it's really you!" The tension in the stranger's shoulders broke visibly, something like profound relief washing over his sharp features, as he stepped just inside the doorway, kneeling immediately to examine the boy's splinted leg with gentle, practiced hands. "We've searched every corner of the eastern woods for you," Aiden said, his voice thick with emotion he was clearly trying to control. "Your father has not slept. He fears the worst had already happened." "I would have," Milo said softly, "if she hadn't found me first." Aiden's pale eyes lifted to Elena, studying her with an intensity that made her want to step back, though she held her ground. "You freed him from a hunter's trap, treated his wounds, and hid him from armed men who came looking, all without knowing what he truly was." It was not quite a question, but Elena answered anyway. "I couldn't leave an injured animal to die. I didn't know what he was until this afternoon. It doesn't change what I would have done." Something shifted in Aiden's expression, a wary respect replacing his earlier caution. "The king will want to know your name, and he will want to thank you properly. But first, we need to get the young prince to safety. The men who set that trap will not have given up their search. If they realize he escaped their reach entirely, they may grow desperate, and desperate men make dangerous mistakes." "Take me with you," Elena said, surprising herself again with how firmly the words left her mouth. "If those men come back here and find this cabin empty, they'll know I was involved somehow. I can't just go back to pretending none of this happened." Aiden studied her for a long moment, weighing something behind his pale eyes, that Elena could not quite read. Finally, he nodded once, sharply. Very well. But understand, once you cross into pack territory, you step into a world with its own laws, its own dangers, and its own king, whose fury tonight burns hotter than any storm this forest has seen in a generation. There is no simple path back out once you enter. Elena looked down at Milo, who gazed up at her with quiet, hopeful trust, the same trust he had shown her the moment she pulled him from that hunter's snare. Whatever waited for her beyond the tree line, she understood there was no version of tonight where she turned her back on this child now. Then let's go, she said, pulling her coat from its hook by the door, before those men find us first. The forest at night looked nothing like the peaceful trails Elena had walked 100 times before. Under Aiden's guidance, every shadow seemed to shift with quiet menace. Every distant rustle carried new weight. He moved through the trees with an ease that made Elena feel clumsy in comparison, his steps silent even over patches of crusted snow, while she carried Milo bundled against her chest, following as closely as she could manage. "How much further?" she whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. 2 hours, if we keep this pace, Aiden replied without turning around. Less, if we take the ridge trail. But the ridge is exposed. If Victor's scouts are watching the borders tonight, we'd be seen easily. Would that be so bad? You said the king is looking for him everywhere. Aiden's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It would be bad if Victor's men saw us first. They already tried once to take Milo. If they realize he's alive and being escorted home, they may attempt something far more reckless before we reach safety. Elena adjusted her grip on Milo, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her shoulder, despite the cold, his small breath steady and even. She felt a fierce, unexpected protectiveness rise in her chest, sharp enough to surprise her. Only a day ago, this boy had been a stranger, an injured animal she stumbled upon by chance. Now the thought of anyone trying to hurt him again made her stomach twist with anger. They walked in tense silence for nearly an hour, weaving through narrow deer trails and half-frozen streams, until Aiden suddenly raised a hand, freezing mid-step. Elena stopped instantly, years of quiet forest walks teaching her to trust the signal of stillness. "What is it?" she breathed. "Someone's moving parallel to us," Aiden murmured, his pale eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness between the trees. "About 30 yards east. Could be one of the king's scouts, could be someone else." He motioned for her to crouch behind a wide, snow-covered boulder, positioning himself protectively in front of her and the sleeping boy. For a long, tense minute, nothing moved except the soft drift of falling snow. Then, from the darkness, a shape emerged, tall and lean, moving on 4 legs with a silent grace that made Elena's breath catch. It was a wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, its fur a deep charcoal gray, its eyes glowing faintly amber in the moonlight. It paused, lifting its nose to the wind, and Elena felt Aiden's body relax slightly beside her. "One of ours," he murmured. "A scout from the Northern Patrol." He rose, stepping into the open with a low, distinct whistle. The wolf's head snapped toward them immediately, and within seconds, the same rippling transformation Elena had witnessed with Milo took hold, bones shifting, fur receding, until a young man stood where the wolf had been, dressed in simple dark clothing that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. "Aiden," the young man said, relief evident in his voice. You found him. Thank the old moon. You actually found him. Get word to the king immediately," Aiden instructed. "Tell him his son is safe, injured but stable, and that we're moving toward the eastern gate. Tell him also," he glanced meaningfully toward Elena, "that a human woman risked her own safety to protect him. She'll need to be treated with the king's full hospitality upon arrival." The scout's eyes widened slightly as they landed on Elena, a flicker of surprise and something like cautious respect crossing his features, before he nodded sharply and vanished back into the trees in his wolf form, moving faster than Elena's eyes could properly track. "He'll reach the packlands well before us," Aiden explained, resuming their trek. "Your presence will not come as a surprise when we arrive." They pressed onward, the terrain growing steeper as they approached what Aiden called the Eastern Ridge, a natural boundary marking the edge of the king's territory. Elena's legs ached with exhaustion, her arms trembling slightly from the effort of carrying Milo's sleeping weight for so long, but she refused to ask for a rest, unwilling to slow their progress even slightly. It was near the top of the ridge that disaster nearly struck. A sharp crack rang out through the trees, unmistakably the sound of a gunshot, followed immediately by a spray of bark exploding from a trunk just beside Aiden's head. He moved with impossible speed, shoving Elena and Milo down behind a fallen log, while spinning to face the direction of the shot, his body already beginning to shift, fur rippling across his arms. "Stay down," he snarled, his voice already deepening into something less human. Elena curled her body protectively around Milo, who had jolted awake at the gunshot, his small frame trembling against her. Through the gaps in the log, she caught fragmented glimpses of movement, dark shapes darting between trees, another gunshot cracking through the night, and then a fierce, guttural snarl that could only have come from Aiden. The confrontation lasted less than a minute, though it felt like an eternity crouched in the freezing snow, Milo's small fingers digging into her sleeve. When the sounds finally quieted, Aiden's voice called out, breathless but steady. "It's clear. You can come out." Elena rose carefully, keeping Milo shielded against her side, and found Aiden standing amid the trees, his clothing torn at one shoulder, a shallow gash bleeding freely down his arm, though his expression remained fiercely composed. Nearby, two men lay motionless on the ground, unconscious rather than worse, their weapons scattered uselessly beside them. "Victor's men," Aiden said grimly, wiping blood from his jaw. "Scouts, likely sent to watch this exact ridge, in case anyone tried to bring Milo home this way." "Are you hurt?" Elena asked, already moving toward him despite the danger that had just passed. "It's shallow. It'll heal by morning." He glanced down at the unconscious men with cold calculation. "We need to move quickly now. If they had a way to signal others, more will be coming." Elena did not need further convincing. She adjusted her hold on Milo, who had gone very quiet and pale, his gray eyes wide with a fear that made him look, for the first time since she'd met him, exactly like the small terrified child he truly was beneath the weight of his royal blood. "It's all right," she murmured to him, as they resumed their trek at a near run now. "We're almost there. You're almost home." They crested the ridge minutes later, and Elena's breath caught at the sight spread below them. Nestled in a wide, snow-covered valley, stood what could only be described as a hidden kingdom. Wooden lodges and stone longhouses, arranged in careful clusters around a massive central hall. Firelight glowing warmly from dozens of windows despite the late hour. Figures moving between buildings with the urgent energy of a community, braced for either terrible news or desperate hope. "Welcome," Aiden said quietly, "to the heart of Blackpine's true kingdom." As they descended the ridge toward the valley, a chorus of howls rose up from within the settlement below, deep and resonant, carrying clearly across the frozen valley. Elena felt Milo stir against her, lifting his head toward the sound, with a small, exhausted smile breaking across his face for the first time in hours. "That's them," he whispered. "They know we're coming. My father knows." Elena's heart pounded as they continued their descent, uncertain what kind of reception awaited a human woman who had unwittingly stumbled into the center of a hidden world's greatest crisis, carrying its most precious and endangered child safely home through the very heart of enemy territory. The moment their small group reached the valley floor, a crowd had already gathered near the wide wooden gates of the settlement, dozens of faces illuminated by torchlight, murmurs rippling through the assembled pack as they caught sight of the boy cradled against Elena's chest. A path opened through the crowd, before Elena even realized what was happening, people stepping back with a mixture of relief and wary curiosity, their eyes shifting constantly between the young prince and the human woman carrying him. Whispers followed her every step, though she could not make out the words, only the tone, equal parts gratitude and suspicion. Then the crowd parted entirely, and a man strode forward whose presence alone seemed to still the very air around him. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than Aiden, with dark hair shot through with premature streaks of gray, and eyes the color of storm clouds just before lightning breaks. He wore simple dark clothing, nothing like a crown or royal finery, yet authority radiated from him so powerfully that Elena instinctively slowed her steps, uncertain whether to bow or simply stand her ground. "Milo," the man breathed, his deep voice cracking on the single word. Milo lifted his head from Elena's shoulder, and despite his exhaustion, a wide smile broke across his young face. "Father." The king crossed the remaining distance in 3 long strides, and Elena carefully transferred the boy into his father's waiting arms, watching as the towering, formidable man cradled his small son with a tenderness that seemed entirely at odds with the fierce authority he carried only moments before. He pressed his lips to Milo's forehead, his eyes closing briefly, his broad shoulders trembling, with what Elena realized, with some surprise, was barely restrained emotion. "I felt you," the king murmured against his son's hair. "I felt the moment you were taken, and I have not drawn a full breath since." "I'm all right, father," Milo said softly, though his small voice wavered with exhaustion. "She saved me. Elena saved me from the trap, and then she hid me from the hunters, and then she brought me all the way here." The king's stormy eyes lifted from his son and settled directly onto Elena for the first time, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though something stubborn in her refused to break the eye contact. "You are the human woman who freed my son," he said, his voice carefully controlled now, though the raw emotion beneath it remained evident. "Aiden's scout brought word ahead of you." "I am," Elena said, straightening her spine despite her exhaustion. "I didn't know what he was when I found him. I only knew an animal was hurt and needed help." "And when you discovered the truth?" "It didn't change anything," Elena said simply. "He was still a child who needed protecting." Something shifted behind the king's stormy gaze, an emotion Elena couldn't quite name, gratitude tangled with something rawer, something closer to disbelief, that such simple kindness could exist so freely from someone entirely outside his world. "I am Draven," he said finally, "alpha and king of this pack, and every soul within Blackpine's true borders. You have done more for my family tonight than you can possibly understand, and I intend to see that debt repaid in full." Before Elena could respond, an older woman pushed through the gathered crowd, her silver hair braided tightly against her scalp, medical satchel already slung over one shoulder. "Enough talk, my king. The boy needs proper attention, and so, I suspect, does she." Her sharp eyes flicked toward Elena's hands, still faintly scraped and bruised from the snare wire the previous night. "Mira is our healer," Draven explained, already moving to follow the woman toward the largest of the stone buildings. "She will see to Milo's injuries properly now, and to yours as well." Elena followed the small procession into the warmth of what appeared to be a combined medical hall and gathering space, watching as Mira examined Milo's splinted leg with quick, practiced hands, murmuring approval at the quality of the initial treatment. "Whoever set this splint knew exactly what they were doing," Mira remarked, glancing up at Elena with newfound respect. "This likely saved the leg from permanent damage." "I volunteer at a wildlife clinic," Elena explained. "I've treated plenty of injured animals before. I just didn't realize this one would turn into a little boy a few hours later." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gathered pack members near the doorway, tension easing slightly at her honest, tired humor. Draven's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly at the sound. As Mira worked to properly set and resplint Milo's leg, applying a poultice that smelled of pine and something earthier Elena couldn't identify, Draven remained close, one large hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder throughout the entire procedure, his eyes rarely straying from the boy's face. Only once Milo had been settled into a warm bed in an adjoining room, finally drifting into peaceful sleep with the reassurance of his father's presence nearby, did Draven turn his full attention back to Elena, guiding her to a quiet side chamber where a fire crackled warmly in a stone hearth. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "You've been through more tonight than any human should reasonably endure." Elena sank gratefully into the offered seat, feeling the accumulated exhaustion of the past 24 hours, finally catching up with her all at once. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Those men who set the trap." Milo mentioned someone named Victor. He said this wasn't random, that someone specifically wanted to hurt your family through him. Draven's expression darkened instantly, the warmth that had briefly softened his features hardening back into something cold and dangerous. "Victor Kane leads the Eastern Pack, a rival bloodline that has coveted these lands for 3 generations. He has grown bold in recent months, testing our borders, provoking small conflicts along the edges of our territory. But this," his jaw tightened, "this is different. This is an act of war, striking at my own son to break me before ever raising a proper challenge." "What happens now?" Elena asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the answer forming behind his stormy eyes. "Now," Draven said, his voice dropping into something low and lethal, "Victor Kane learns precisely what it costs to threaten the blood of this kingdom. I have shown restraint for months, hoping to avoid unnecessary bloodshed between our peoples. That restraint ended the moment his men laid a trap for my child in these woods. Elena studied the fierce, controlled fury radiating from him, understanding intuitively that whatever quiet peace had existed between the two rival packs was already shattering beyond repair. Milo could have died tonight, if I hadn't heard him, if those men had found him first. I am aware, Draven said, his voice suddenly quieter, heavier, and I will not forget that a human woman, with no obligation to my world or my people, chose to risk everything for a child she did not know. That debt does not simply disappear because the danger has passed for tonight. I didn't do it to be repaid, Elena said honestly. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Something in Draven's stormy eyes shifted again at her words, an expression far more complicated than simple gratitude settling across his sharp features, though he said nothing further on the matter, instead rising and moving toward the window, staring out at the darkened valley beyond. Rest tonight, he said finally. You are safe within these walls, safer than you have been since the moment you stepped into that forest. Tomorrow, there will be much to discuss, decisions that must be made regarding your safety, and regarding the war that is now, undeniably, already upon us. Elena watched his broad shoulders remain tense even in stillness, understanding that somewhere beyond these warm walls, beneath a sky still heavy with falling snow, an ancient and dangerous conflict had just been set irreversibly into motion, and she, an ordinary woman who had simply wanted to save an injured animal, now stood at the very center of it. Elena woke the next morning to unfamiliar warmth and the distant sound of voices speaking in low, urgent tones, somewhere beyond the wooden walls of the small guest room she had been given. For a moment, disoriented, she forgot entirely where she was, until the events of the previous night rushed back in a dizzying wave. She dressed quickly, in clothes someone had left folded neatly on a chair, simple but well made, clearly borrowed from the pack's stores, and made her way toward the sound of voices, following the scent of wood smoke and something warm cooking nearby. The central hall buzzed with activity despite the early hour, pack members moving purposefully between tasks, some carrying weapons that looked more ceremonial than practical, others deep in hushed conversation that quieted noticeably whenever Elena passed within earshot. She found Draven in a large meeting room, dominated by a heavy wooden table, surrounded by several serious-faced advisors, Aiden among them, his shoulder now properly bandaged. The conversation stopped the moment she entered, several pairs of eyes turning toward her, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open distrust. Elena, Draven said, rising from his seat immediately. I hope you slept well. Better than expected, she admitted, aware of the weight of unfamiliar stares following her every movement. I don't want to interrupt. You're not interrupting, Draven said, though one of the older advisors, a broad-shouldered man with a heavily scarred face, made a small sound of disagreement that he quickly disguised as a cough. This is Garrick, Draven introduced, gesturing to the scarred man. My senior war advisor, and this is Elena, the woman who saved Milo's life. Garrick's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her, his expression carefully neutral, though clearly unconvinced. My king speaks highly of your actions. But forgive me for asking plainly, is it wise to discuss matters of pack security so openly in front of an outsider, however well-intentioned she may be? She has already proven her loyalty more clearly than some who were born into this pack, Draven said, his tone carrying a subtle edge that made Garrick's jaw tighten, though he said nothing further in protest. Elena, uncomfortable being discussed as though she weren't standing directly in the room, cleared her throat. I can wait outside, if that would make everyone more comfortable. That won't be necessary, Draven said firmly, gesturing for her to take an empty seat near the end of the table. You are involved in this matter, whether any of us wish it or not. Victor's men know your face now. Your safety is already tied to the outcome of what we decide here. The reminder settled uncomfortably in Elena's stomach. She had not fully considered, until this moment, that returning to her ordinary life might no longer be a simple option. The meeting continued around her, advisors discussing troop movements, border patrols, and the location of suspected scouts along the eastern ridge where Aiden had been ambushed the previous night. Elena understood perhaps half the terminology used, but the underlying tension was unmistakable, an entire community bracing itself for open conflict that felt, increasingly, unavoidable. Victor will deny involvement, Garrick was saying, tracing a rough map spread across the table with one scarred finger. He always does. He'll claim the hunters acted independently, perhaps even offer some low-ranking scapegoat to satisfy appearances. It won't matter, Draven said coldly. Everyone in this valley knows the truth. My son was nearly stolen from these lands by men in his employ. Denial changes nothing. With respect, my king, another advisor spoke up, a slender woman with keen dark eyes. Open war carries enormous risk. Victor's numbers have grown substantially over the past year. If this escalates beyond controlled skirmishes, I am aware of the risks, Fenna, Draven interrupted, though not unkindly. But I will not allow a threat against my own bloodline to stand unanswered simply because the cost of justice might prove expensive. What message would that send to every pack watching how we respond? The room fell into tense silence, broken only when Elena, surprising herself, spoke up. May I ask something? Every eye turned toward her again, and she pressed forward despite the discomfort. Is there any way to expose Victor's involvement publicly, undeniably, before resorting to war? If everyone already suspects the truth, wouldn't proof change how other packs view the situation? Wouldn't that isolate him, rather than risk your own people in open conflict? Garrick's expression shifted slightly, something like grudging consideration replacing his earlier dismissiveness. The hunters we captured near the ridge last night, if we could extract a confession, something tying them directly to Victor's coin, they'll be loyal to him, Fenna cautioned. Men in his employ don't easily betray their master, even under pressure. Not all men remain loyal when facing the true consequences of their actions, Draven said slowly, something calculating entering his stormy gaze, as he considered Elena's suggestion with newfound interest. Bring the prisoners to me. I wish to speak with them myself. As the meeting shifted focus toward this new strategy, Elena felt several of the advisors' gazes soften slightly toward her, the earlier suspicion tempered now by grudging acknowledgement that her outsider's perspective had offered something valuable to their deliberations. Later that afternoon, while Draven and Garrick questioned the captured hunters in a separate building, Elena found herself walking through the settlement with Aiden as her guide, curious, despite everything, to understand more of the world she had stumbled into. You handled that meeting well, Aiden remarked, as they walked past rows of modest wooden homes, children playing in the snow between them. Some in human form, others as small wolf pups tumbling playfully together. Garrick doesn't warm easily to outsiders. That he didn't argue further says something. I only said what seemed obvious, Elena replied, watching the children with quiet fascination. War seems like the worst possible outcome for everyone involved. It often is, Aiden agreed. But some conflicts become unavoidable, regardless of how carefully anyone tries to prevent them. Victor has wanted this valley for a long time. I doubt any confession will fully satisfy his ambitions. They paused near a wide clearing where several young wolves trained in human form, practicing hand-to-hand combat, under the watchful supervision of an instructor. Elena noted the discipline in their movements, controlled and precise rather than reckless. Milo mentioned his father hasn't slept properly since he went missing, Elena said quietly. How is he handling all of this, really? Aiden's expression grew thoughtful. Draven lost his own mate several years ago, before Milo was old enough to properly remember her. Since then, his son has been the single most important part of his life, beyond even his duties as king. Nearly losing him has shaken something in Draven that I have rarely seen shift in all my years serving beside him. Elena absorbed this information quietly, understanding a bit more now about the raw emotion she had witnessed the previous night, when Draven first held his son again. Whatever formidable authority the man carried as king, beneath it existed simply a father who had nearly lost everything that mattered most to him. Come, Aiden said, noting the contemplative look on her face. The king will want you present when the hunters are questioned. Your instincts proved useful this morning. He may value them again. As they made their way toward the building where the captured hunters were being held, Elena couldn't shake the growing awareness that her simple act of mercy in a snow-covered forest had pulled her into something far larger and more permanent than she had initially understood. A conflict between kingdoms that would demand far more from her than she had ever anticipated giving. The building where the captured hunters were held stood apart from the rest of the settlement, a squat stone structure with narrow windows that let in only thin bars of afternoon light. Elena followed Aiden inside, her stomach tightening at the sight of the two men from her cabin doorstep, now seated in wooden chairs, wrists bound, their earlier confidence replaced by visible unease. Draven stood before them, arms crossed, his presence alone seeming to fill the small room with tension thick enough to taste. Garrick stood slightly behind him, arms folded, his scarred face unreadable. "You know who I am," Draven said, his voice deceptively calm. "And you know precisely what you attempted to steal from these lands." The older of the two hunters, the one who had spoken to Elena at her door, kept his eyes fixed stubbornly on the floor. "We were paid to capture a wolf pup, that's all. We don't ask questions about who hires us." "A convenient answer," Draven said, "but not, I think, an honest one." He crouched slightly, bringing himself level with the seated man's downcast eyes. "You knew exactly what you were hunting. Silver coat. A specific location, deep within my territory, precisely where my son had wandered that evening. That is not the work of casual poachers seeking easy profit." The younger hunter shifted nervously in his seat, glancing toward his companion before speaking. "We didn't know he was your son. We were just told it was valuable. Rare." The client didn't explain why. "And who was this client?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of a small fire in the corner hearth. Elena watched Draven's expression remain carefully composed, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the effort it cost him. "I understand loyalty to those who pay you," Draven said finally, his voice dropping into something quieter, more dangerous. "But consider carefully what loyalty is worth, against a king whose son was nearly stolen from him. I have shown considerable restraint thus far. That restraint has limits." The older hunter's jaw tightened, sweat beading, despite the cold stone room. "His name was never given to us directly. We dealt with an intermediary. Man named Corvin. Works the border towns between your territory and the eastern lands." "Eastern lands," Garrick repeated, exchanging a meaningful glance with Draven. "Victor Kane's territory." "We don't know that for certain," the younger hunter said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "But you suspected it," Elena said quietly from where she stood near the doorway, drawing surprised glances from everyone in the room. "You wouldn't have taken a job that dangerous without at least suspecting who was really behind it." The older hunter's eyes flicked toward her, something like grudging acknowledgement crossing his weathered features. "The pay was too good to ask too many questions. But yeah, we suspected. Nobody else around here has coin like that to throw around, or reason to want something from this pack specifically." Draven straightened slowly, his stormy eyes darkening with quiet fury that Elena recognized now as the controlled kind, more dangerous for its restraint than any outburst could have been. "Corvin will be found, and when he is, he will tell us everything he knows about who truly hired him." As Draven and Garrick continued extracting details about Corvin's usual haunts and known associates, Aiden touched Elena's elbow gently, drawing her attention toward the doorway. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly, once they had stepped outside into the cold afternoon air. "Something I discovered while tracking the second hunter through the woods last night, before I found their trail leading toward your cabin." Elena's stomach tightened at the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" "Footprints," Aiden said. "Wolf prints, moving alongside the human tracks for a significant distance, then breaking away separately before the men reached the trap site. Someone from within our own territory may have guided them to that exact location." The implication settled heavily over Elena. "You think someone in the pack helped set the trap for Milo?" "I think it's possible," Aiden said grimly. "And if that's true, it means Victor has eyes and ears somewhere close to the king himself. Someone with intimate knowledge of Milo's usual wandering paths through the forest." "Have you told Draven?" "Not yet. I wanted to be certain before bringing him information that could tear apart trust within his own inner circle, at the worst possible moment." Aiden's pale eyes settled on her with unexpected weight. "You have good instincts, Elena. Sharper than most who've lived their whole lives within pack politics. What do you make of it?" Elena considered the question seriously, appreciating, despite everything, being asked for her genuine opinion, rather than dismissed as an outsider unfamiliar with their world. If someone close to Draven is working with Victor, revealing it too early might just cause them to disappear or cover their tracks more carefully. But waiting too long risks them causing further harm, especially now that tensions are already this high. "A careful balance," Aiden agreed. "One my king will need to walk delicately." even as war draws closer by the hour. They returned to the main hall as evening settled over the valley, finding it already filling with pack members gathering for what Elena quickly understood was an emergency council, word having spread rapidly, regarding the hunter's confession, implicating Victor's territory. Draven stood at the head of the hall, his presence commanding immediate silence, as the assembled crowd quieted. "Tonight, we have confirmation of what many already suspected," he announced, his deep voice carrying easily to every corner of the packed room. "Victor Kane's territory harbors the man responsible for orchestrating an attack against my own son, within the sanctity of our protected lands." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, tension and anger palpable in the air. "I have shown patience with Victor's provocations for many months," Draven continued, his voice hardening. "Border skirmishes, stolen livestock, even the occasional wounded scout, I let pass as the growing pains of an ambitious rival testing boundaries. But this," his eyes swept the room, "this was an act of war against my own bloodline, and it will not go unanswered." The hall erupted briefly into a mixture of approving growls and tense murmurs, before Draven raised a hand, restoring silence. "At first light, our warriors moved to the eastern border. We will demand Victor answer for this crime publicly, before every witness capable of holding him accountable. If he refuses to answer honestly, if he continues hiding behind denial and false intermediaries, then Blackpine will take by force the justice he refuses to grant willingly." Elena watched the assembled pack absorb this declaration, faces hardening with resolve, weapons being checked and prepared even as the meeting continued. Whatever fragile peace had existed between the two rival packs was now, undeniably, shattering completely. War arriving, not with gradual escalation, but with the swift, decisive fury of a king whose child had nearly been stolen from him. As the hall began to empty, pack members moving to prepare for the confrontation awaiting them at dawn, Draven's eyes found Elena across the thinning crowd, holding her gaze with an intensity that carried far more than simple gratitude now, something complicated and unspoken passing silently between them. Tomorrow, before the sun fully rose over Blackpine's frozen valley, two ancient rival packs would stand at the very edge of open war, and Elena, an ordinary woman who had only wanted to save an injured animal, now found herself standing directly at the heart of a conflict that would reshape the fate of an entire hidden kingdom. Elena could not sleep that night. She lay in the small guest room, staring at the wooden ceiling beams, listening to the muffled sounds of preparation continuing throughout the settlement despite the late hour. Warriors sharpening weapons, hushed strategy discussions carrying faintly through walls, the occasional low howl rising from somewhere near the training grounds. Eventually, restlessness won over any pretense of rest, and she rose, wrapping a borrowed cloak around her shoulders, before slipping out into the cold night air. She found Draven standing alone near the edge of the settlement, staring out at the dark tree line beyond, his powerful frame silhouetted against the pale moonlight. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly, approaching carefully. He turned, something in his stormy eyes softening slightly at the sight of her. "There is much weighing on my mind tonight." Elena moved to stand beside him, following his gaze toward the distant ridge where, come morning, his warriors would march toward confrontation with a rival pack that had already proven willing to target his own child. "Are you afraid?" The question seemed to surprise him, and for a long moment, he said nothing, simply watching the wind stir the snow along the tree line. "I have led warriors into conflict before," he admitted finally, "but never with the knowledge that failure might mean my son grows up in a world where his father could not protect their home from those who wish us harm." "You're not doing this alone," Elena said. "Your advisors, your warriors, they all believe in you. I've seen it, even in the short time I've been here." "Perhaps," Draven said quietly, "but leadership carries a particular weight that cannot be fully shared, no matter how loyal those around you may be." He turned to face her fully, his expression shifting into something more open than she had yet seen from him. "You have carried far more than any ordinary human should have been asked to bear these past 2 days, and yet you have met every challenge with a courage I did not expect to find outside my own people." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold night air. "I just did what felt right. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Draven said, his voice firm. "Not anyone. Most would have called the authorities, or simply walked away from danger they did not understand. You chose differently, again and again. even when it would have been far easier and far safer to abandon my son to whatever fate awaited him. The weight of his gratitude, combined with the raw vulnerability in his stormy eyes, created a tension between them that Elena had been carefully avoiding acknowledging since the moment they first met. "Milo is a remarkable child," she said, deflecting slightly. "It wasn't difficult to want to protect him." "He speaks of you constantly," Draven said, a faint, genuine smile briefly touching his features. "Elena did this. Elena said that. I believe, in the short time you have known him, you have become someone quite important to my son." "And to his father?" The words left her mouth before she could fully consider them, and she immediately wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary between them. Draven's expression grew thoughtful, searching, as though weighing an answer carefully before speaking it aloud. "You have become important to me as well, in ways I confess I did not anticipate when Aiden first brought word that a human woman had saved my son's life." Before either of them could explore the weight of that admission further, hurried footsteps approached from the direction of the main hall, and Aiden appeared, his expression tight with urgency that immediately shattered the fragile intimacy of the moment. "My king, we've found Corvin," he announced. "Or rather, we found where he had been hiding. He's fled, but he left something behind that you need to see immediately." Draven's entire demeanor shifted instantly back into commanding authority, following Aiden at a brisk pace toward the main hall, Elena close behind, her heart pounding with anxious anticipation. Inside, Garrick waited with a small leather satchel spread open on the table, its contents laid out carefully. Elena's eyes widened at the collection of documents, coded messages, and what appeared to be detailed maps of packed territory, including notations marking Milo's known wandering paths through the forest with unsettling precision. "This is more detailed than any outsider could have gathered alone," Garrick said grimly, his scarred face tight with barely controlled anger. "Whoever provided this information knew the young prince's habits intimately, knew exactly where and when he was most likely to wander unsupervised." Draven's jaw tightened as he examined the maps, his stormy eyes darkening further with each passing second. "Someone within these walls provided this information." "There's more," Aiden said quietly, retrieving a folded letter from the satchel and passing it directly to Draven. This was addressed to Corvin, but the handwriting. Draven unfolded the letter, his expression growing increasingly rigid as he read its contents, before finally looking up, his voice dangerously quiet. "This handwriting belongs to someone within my own council." The room fell into stunned silence. Elena watched the color drain slightly from Fenna's face where she stood near the doorway, though whether from guilt or simple shock at the revelation, Elena could not immediately determine. "Whose?" Garrick demanded, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. Draven's eyes lifted slowly, scanning the faces gathered in the room, before finally settling with terrible certainty on someone standing near the back, someone Elena had not yet formally met, a quiet, unassuming man, who had said little throughout the previous council meetings, but had been present at each one. "Bram," Draven said, his voice deadly calm, despite the fury radiating from every line of his powerful frame. "My own advisor on trade and border relations. Explain to me why your handwriting appears on a letter addressed to the very man who arranged the theft of my son." The man called Bram froze, his eyes darting toward the exits, his composure cracking visibly under the weight of Draven's terrible, controlled fury. In that single suspended moment, Elena understood that whatever careful strategy Draven had planned for confronting Victor Kane at dawn had just become infinitely more complicated, a betrayal from within his own trusted circle threatening to unravel the very foundation of the confrontation awaiting them at first light. Bram's hand moved toward the door, but two warriors stationed near the entrance closed the distance instantly, blocking any hope of escape. His shoulders sagged, the careful mask of quiet loyalty he had worn for years, finally crumbling entirely under the weight of undeniable evidence. "Why?" Draven's voice cut through the tense silence, quieter now than his earlier fury, which somehow made it more unsettling. "You have served this pack for over a decade. You have sat at my table, advised my decisions, watched my son grow. Why would you betray us to Victor Kane?" Bram's eyes lifted, and Elena saw not defiance in them, but a bitter, resigned exhaustion. "You wouldn't understand. You've never had to watch your own family suffer while others prospered under your rule." "Explain it to me then," Draven said. "My brother," Bram said, his voice cracking slightly. 2 years ago, during the border dispute near the Western Creek, he was injured defending pack lands you insisted on holding. Though the territory carried little value beyond pride, he lost the use of his leg. You compensated him modestly and moved on, while I watched him struggle every single day since, unable to hunt properly, unable to provide for his own family. I offered him a permanent place among my council staff, Draven said, his voice tight. I offered further support that he refused out of pride. Pride does not feed children, Bram snapped, some of his earlier bitterness surfacing openly now. Victor offered real help, real compensation, ongoing support for my brother's family, in exchange for information about patrol schedules, about minor details that seemed harmless at the time. I told myself it was nothing significant. Until it became information that nearly cost my son his life, Draven finished, his voice hardening again. Bram's face paled further. I didn't know that's what the information would be used for. I swear it. Victor's people asked about Milo's habits months ago, framed as simple curiosity about pack routines. I never imagined they intended to harm him directly. Yet you continued providing information, even after suspecting its true purpose, Garrick said coldly, rather than coming forward the moment you realized the danger. Bram had no answer for this, his silence confirming the accusation more completely than any words could have. Draven studied the broken man before him for a long, heavy moment, something complicated moving behind his stormy eyes, anger tangled with something almost like weary understanding. Take him to the holding cells, he finally instructed the waiting warriors. He will face proper judgment once this immediate crisis has passed. But know this, Bram, your brother's suffering does not excuse endangering an innocent child. Whatever justice you believed you were seeking, you have only brought greater danger upon everyone you claim to be protecting. As the warriors led Bram away, the hall fell into a heavy, exhausted silence. Elena watched Draven's shoulders drop slightly once the door closed, the weight of betrayal from within his own trusted circle, clearly cutting deeper than any external threat could have managed. This changes things, Garrick said quietly, once they were alone with only Aiden and Fenna remaining in the room. Victor didn't simply exploit an external opportunity. He cultivated a source within our own council for months, perhaps longer. His planning here was patient, deliberate. Which means, Draven said slowly, that tomorrow's confrontation cannot simply be a demand for accountability. Victor has shown he is willing to play a long, patient game to weaken us from within. Direct confrontation alone may not be enough to end this threat permanently. Elena, who had remained quiet through the difficult revelation, found herself speaking up again, an idea forming as she considered everything she had witnessed over the past 2 days. What if you didn't confront him with only accusations and threats of war? What if you brought him proof, undeniable evidence of his own advisor's confession, in front of witnesses from other neutral packs who could verify the truth publicly? Draven's stormy eyes turned toward her, considering. Explain further. You said other packs are watching how this conflict unfolds, Elena continued. If Victor is exposed publicly and undeniably as the architect of an attack against a child, using stolen information from a bribed advisor, wouldn't that damage his standing among other packs far more severely than an isolated border battle ever could? Wars end, but reputations, once shattered, are much harder to rebuild. Aiden's expression shifted thoughtfully. She's suggesting we turn this from a matter of private vengeance into public judgment. Force Victor to answer not just to us, but to the wider council of packs, who value honor above ambition. It's risky, Garrick admitted slowly, but it carries less immediate cost in lives than open warfare, provided Victor doesn't simply refuse to appear before such a gathering at all. He'll refuse if given time to prepare a defense, Draven said, something calculating entering his expression now. But if we move at dawn as planned, arriving with undeniable proof before he has any warning to construct excuses or eliminate further evidence, he may have no choice but to face judgment in front of witnesses whose opinion he cannot afford to lose. The plan took shape quickly after that. Warriors dispatched under cover of darkness to neutral packs along the border, inviting their leaders to witness what Draven now intended as a public reckoning, rather than an immediate declaration of war. Elena found herself swept into the frantic preparations, offering what practical help she could as the night wore on toward dawn. Near the final hours before sunrise, as warriors gathered at the settlement's edge preparing for the march toward the eastern border, Draven approached Elena directly, his expression serious. "You should remain here, where it's safe," he said. "Whatever happens at the border carries genuine risk, and I would not forgive myself if harm came to you after everything you've already sacrificed for my son." "Milo will be here," Elena said. "He'll want someone with him who understands what's happening, someone he trusts. I can do that much at least while you're gone." Something in Draven's stormy eyes softened at her answer. Gratitude, and something deeper passing silently between them once again. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything. Whatever happens today, know that Blackpine, and I personally, owe you a debt that mere words cannot properly repay." As the warriors began their march toward the eastern ridge under the fading darkness of early morning, Elena stood at the settlement's edge beside Milo, watching Draven's broad shoulders disappear into the tree line, praying silently that the careful plan they had constructed through the long, difficult night would be enough to prevent the full weight of war from falling upon this hidden kingdom she had so unexpectedly come to care for. The eastern ridge overlooking Victor Kane's territory came into view just as the first pale light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in soft shades of gold and gray. Draven led his warriors forward with measured, deliberate steps, flanked by Garrick and Aiden, while behind them, leaders from 3 neutral packs walked cautiously, having accepted the urgent invitation to witness whatever unfolded at this unusual and unprecedented gathering. Victor Kane emerged from his own settlement to meet them, flanked by a dozen armed warriors, his expression carrying the confident arrogance of a man who believed himself thoroughly prepared for whatever accusations awaited him. He was tall, lean, with sharp calculating eyes, and a smile that never quite reached them. "Draven," Victor called out, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of false welcome. Such an unusual hour for a visit, and with such distinguished company. His eyes swept over the neutral pack leaders with poorly disguised curiosity and concern. "You know why I've come," Draven said, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen distance between them. "Do I?" Victor's smile remained fixed, though something flickered briefly behind his calculating eyes. "I confess, I'm at a loss." 2 nights ago, Draven said, stepping forward with deliberate calm. "Hunters in your employ set an illegal trap deep within my protected territory, attempting to capture my own son, using detailed information about his habits provided by an advisor within my own council, bribed through your intermediary, Corvin." Murmurs rippled through the gathered neutral pack leaders, their expressions shifting from curiosity to genuine alarm at the serious nature of the accusation being leveled so publicly. "A serious claim," Victor said carefully, "though I fail to see what proof exists connecting me personally to such an unfortunate incident, assuming it even occurred as you describe." Draven nodded once toward Garrick, who stepped forward and unrolled a set of documents before the assembled witnesses, the maps detailing Milo's wandering paths, the coded messages, and finally, the damning letter bearing Bram's confirmed handwriting. "My former advisor has confessed fully to providing this information in exchange for ongoing financial support for his injured brother," Draven continued, his voice hardening. "Support arranged and funded directly through your intermediary. He awaits proper judgment within my own lands even now." Victor's confident expression finally cracked slightly, his calculating eyes scanning the documents with poorly concealed alarm. "Even if such an arrangement existed, gathering information hardly constitutes an attack. I cannot control what independent hunters chose to do with knowledge that reached them through unofficial channels. The hunters have already confessed to being directly employed for this specific purpose," Aiden interjected coldly. "Capture the young prince alive, a task specific enough that only deliberate intent explains it." The neutral pack leaders exchanged increasingly troubled glances among themselves, clearly weighing the mounting evidence against Victor's weakening protests. One of them, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, representing the Northern Territories, finally spoke up. "Victor," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority, earned through decades of careful leadership, "if these accusations prove true, you have not merely provoked a border dispute. You have targeted an innocent child, using bribery and deception against a fellow leader who has, by all accounts, dealt honorably with every pack along these borders for years." "This is a fabrication," Victor snapped, his composure finally slipping fully, "constructed to justify aggression against my territory." "Then explain," Draven said quietly, "why Corvin fled, the moment we discovered his hiding place, or why my former advisor's confession matches every detail found within these documents with such precise accuracy. Victor had no answer, his silence stretching uncomfortably long before the assembled witnesses, his earlier confidence crumbling visibly under the combined weight of undeniable proof, and the judgment now forming clearly in the eyes of his fellow pack leaders. I did not order harm to come to the child directly, Victor finally admitted, his voice tight with barely controlled fury at being cornered so completely. I sought only to weaken Draven's resolve, to remind him that his continued expansion into contested territories carries consequences. You sought to use a child as a weapon against his father, the silver-haired leader said, her voice carrying open disgust now. There is no honorable framing for such an action, Victor Kane, regardless of your justifications. The gathered witnesses began murmuring among themselves, their expressions making clear that whatever standing Victor had once held among neighboring packs was crumbling rapidly beneath the weight of his exposed betrayal. Draven watched this unfold with careful, controlled patience, understanding that the true victory here lay not in bloodshed, but in this very public unraveling of his rival's credibility and honor. I will not seek war today, Draven announced finally, his voice carrying clearly to every witness present. Though you have given me ample cause, instead, I demand full reparation for the danger brought against my son, and I demand these neighboring packs witness your formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, so that no future ambiguity exists regarding what transpired here. Victor's jaw tightened with barely suppressed fury, but surrounded by witnesses whose future cooperation and trade he could not afford to lose entirely, he had little choice but to comply, offering a stiff, humiliating acknowledgement of his role in the affair before the assembled leaders. As the tense gathering finally began to disperse, the immediate threat of open warfare averted through careful strategy rather than bloodshed, Draven felt something within him ease for the first time since the terrifying moment he first realized his son had gone missing. The warriors returned to the settlement by mid-morning, exhaustion evident in their weary steps, though the mood carried triumphant relief rather than the grim resignation of men returning from battle. Elena spotted them approaching from the settlement's edge, Milo bouncing excitedly beside her, and felt her heart lift at the sight of Draven's broad, unharmed figure leading the procession home. "Father!" Milo called out, running forward the moment the group came within reach, and Draven swept his son up into his arms, relief and love radiating openly across features that had carried such fierce, controlled tension throughout the previous tense day. "It's over?" Elena asked as Draven approached her, Milo still held securely against his chest. "For now," Draven said, though something lighter had settled into his stormy eyes. "Victor's ambitions have been checked, his reputation among neighboring packs severely damaged. It will take him considerable time to recover any standing capable of threatening us again." Over the following weeks, life within the settlement gradually settled back into a steadier rhythm, though Elena found herself increasingly reluctant to return to her quiet, ordinary life beyond the forest's borders. Milo had grown attached to her presence, seeking her out constantly for stories and quiet companionship, while Draven's gratitude had slowly transformed into something warmer, something neither of them seemed quite ready to name directly, though it lived clearly in every lingering glance and quiet conversation shared between them. One evening, as the first true signs of spring began melting the deep snow along the valley's edges, Draven found Elena sitting near the same ridge where she had first glimpsed the hidden kingdom 2 months earlier. "You've been quiet today," he observed, settling beside her. "I've been thinking about home," Elena admitted. "My old life, the clinic, my cabin, everything I left behind so suddenly." Draven's expression grew serious, though he said nothing to interrupt her thoughts. "But mostly," she continued, turning to meet his stormy eyes directly, "I've been thinking that home isn't really about a place. It's about where you feel like you truly belong." "And where do you feel you belong?" Draven asked quietly, though something hopeful had entered his voice, despite his careful restraint. Elena reached for his hand, finding it warm and steady despite the cool evening air settling over the valley. "Somewhere I can watch Milo grow up safely. Somewhere I can help protect this remarkable, complicated world you've shown me. Somewhere, I think, beside you." Draven's fingers tightened gently around hers, a genuine, unguarded smile finally breaking fully across his sharp features. "Then let Blackpine be your home, Elena, not merely as a guest, or a hero owed some unpayable debt. but as someone who belongs here, as fully and completely as any soul born within these lands. As the sun set gently over the valley, painting the melting snow in soft shades of amber and rose, Elena understood that the frightened, injured cub she had pulled from a hunter's cruel trap had led her not simply into a hidden world of ancient bloodlines and dangerous politics, but into a life richer and more meaningful than she had ever imagined possible, a life where courage and compassion had ultimately proven far stronger than any threat of war, forging an unexpected bond between two entirely different worlds that would endure for generations to come.